Our next session is going to take us beyond Northwest Arkansas to look at some lessons from other regions that have embraced pro-housing policies. Cullum Clark is the director of the Bush Institute at SMU's Economic Growth Initiative. He's an adjunct professor of economics at SMU. In his work, he focuses on how regions can achieve long-term prosperity by tackling challenges like housing, affordability, education, and workforce readiness. Cullum has become a national voice on how housing supply, zoning reform, and smart growth strategies directly affect economic competitiveness and opportunity. Cullum's insights connect housing not just to affordability, but to our ability as a region to attract talent, grow business, and ensure opportunity for future generations. With that, please join me in welcoming Cullum Clark to the stage.
Thank you. All right. Thank you so much for having me. It's really an honor to be with you today. First of all, many thanks to my good friend Duke McClarty and the Groundwork team for having me and for putting on a great event. I have certainly learned a lot today. But nice to meet a number of you all. A real honor to get to know Representative Clowney and hear about the good work that's going on here. But I really want to say to all of you all that it's really kind of remarkable to see this group out here talking about this issue in this region. It does seem to me, sort of from the point of view of someone from out of town who studied the data a lot, that your region is doing actually better than the vast majority of them. Not a reason for complacency, but when that is the case and you have people determined to do, considerably better still, that is impressive. So I'm going to talk about housing and try to link it, if you will, to the idea of the Northwest Arkansas miracle. I don't know if you all use that term. We use it down in Texas about our own region. I'll refer a little bit to how home prices and affordability influence broader economic outcomes. A little bit about how Northwest Arkansas is doing, but also how you all can contribute to a bright future for yourselves and all of America. I will say a few things about the future. Everyone has their favorite quotes about predicting the future. Here's one I like a lot. There was a Nobel Prize-winning economist, Ken Arrow. During the World War II, he ran a unit that was charged with making weather forecasts ahead of things like the Normandy invasion. And there came this moment when he pointed out to the people he was working for that his group's forecasts were no better than random chance. And he got back this kind of infamous reply: the commanding general is well aware that the forecasts are no good. However, he needs them for planning purposes. So all of us are trying to deal in the future, take it with a grain of salt. So I'll say a little bit about why housing supply and affordability matters, why Arkansans should care. Probably preaching to the choir with this group, but nonetheless, good for us all to sort of share a common baseline here. How America is doing in a few slides, how Northwest Arkansas is doing, and some principles for building high opportunity, reasonably affordable places. And I think it's important to say kind of reasonably affordable because great places are never dirt cheap, right? People want to be there. The places that are dirt cheap in general are places that sadly people and businesses are abandoning. Obviously not the problem here. So really quickly, where I work, I have the honor of leading the economic work of the George W. Bush Institute. We are the think tank, and as President Bush likes to say, the do tank arm of the George W. Bush Presidential Center, also a library there. We have a great museum about the Bush presidency. Please come to Dallas, and love to show you around. At any rate, and the do tank piece is important. We really are under kind of a lot of expectation there, not just to write papers, but to get out and mix it up with real policymakers trying to solve real problems, as a number of people here are trying to do. Our mission is applying certain timeless American values, among them freedom, opportunity, accountability, and compassion to the pressing issues of our own time, and that is what got me into housing. Our economic work kind of falls into these two buckets. I'll just say on the left, mostly what we're talking about today is basically all about how we can create prosperous, opportunity-rich cities, towns, and neighborhoods in 21st century America, what I think of as one of the central challenges of our time. We also, on the right, do various work on that is kind of more national in scale. How can we take this thing, American democratic capitalism, and make it work for more Americans in today's conditions? On the city side, I've had the opportunity to write about this in a lot of different ways. Among other things, a book I co-authored with Henry Cisneros, former mayor of San Antonio and Secretary of Housing and Urban Development. He's on the National Housing Crisis Task Force with me and Duke and Michael. And you're right, we wrote this book about the rise of the mega region, as we called it, the Texas Triangle, the mega region formed by the 4 big metropolitan areas of our state: Houston, Dallas-Fort Worth, Austin, and San Antonio. Some would say only in Texas would we connect 4 points on a map with a triangle, but that's my last joke, really. But I've had the chance also to write about housing a fair bit in things like City Journal and a lot in local places in Dallas. So in early 2005, we released this report. We call it Build Homes, Expand Opportunity, Lessons from America's Fastest Growing Cities. And that's mostly what I want to talk about. So in one slide, why should Arkansans care? All of you all, of course, are citizens and residents at several levels: America, the state, the region, the individual towns and communities in which you live. From the American point of view, again, I know I'm probably preaching to the choir, but let's just acknowledge that as a sort of baseline agreement, that housing is intimately linked, joined at the hip with opportunity and the creation of prosperity in our cities and towns. It is not just a roof over people's heads, though that is vital. It is all about what kind of access to jobs and economic opportunities of all kinds they will have. It is about whether people will be able to save money in our economy. If you don't accumulate any savings, it's extremely difficult to get ahead. You all understand that well, but about 40% of the American people don't really accumulate any savings at all. That ratio has gone up, and housing prices are probably the single biggest culprit causing that change. And of course, home ownership, we all know, for a great many Americans, for much of sort of middle-class America, is the principal means of wealth generation as well. We also know that when we mess it up, the people who suffer the most are our most vulnerable lower-income residents. I think that from the dawn of time, housing has been probably a top-tier challenge for low-income people everywhere, but it has unquestionably gotten worse, and by a significant measure, in America over the last 25 years, and that is a national crisis, if ever there was one. In the region that we're in today, let me just suggest that affordability has been a really important advantage. I mean, it's awesome being the headquarters of Walmart and J.B. Hunt and the other companies here, but without affordability, without a significant edge, I suggest to you that things would have gone really quite differently. I also want to suggest to you that the housing decisions, the choices that get made in this region will really powerfully influence all kinds of aspects about the future trajectory of this region. Who will live here? What kind of communities will exist? How much growth will really occur? And by extension, it'll powerfully affect the future of the whole state because, as we've heard today, it's a state with one really, really booming area and kind of, from what I can make out, a sort of okay economy in the capital and a lot of struggle elsewhere. So you really need this prosperity to go on and to spread. But I also want to say you're all residents of some individual town, community, certainly neighborhood, and the housing decisions will make a really big difference at the hyper-local level, determining who can live there. Will your children, if you have some, grow up to be able to afford to live in the same town that you live in? Will the teachers who teach your children be able to live there? How long will commutes be? I want to argue to you that that's not just the sort of thing that, however long it is, that's how long it is. No, it won't go beyond a certain level because people would elect to live elsewhere. And of course, the question that's come up, I think, a couple times today, how financially sustainable will the whole development model be? So a little bit about our country, really fast. So very simply, in my report, I argue that we have underbuilt by about 5 to 7 million units, that substantially all of that underbuilding took place in the 21st century, that we were kind of, we were not in nirvana conditions, but we were kind of more or less had built at about the pace we ought to have been building for probably the whole 50 years, second half of the 20th century. Not so more recently. Other estimates range from 3 to 8 million of underdevelopment. Home prices and rents, I argue with a lot of quantitative analysis, are probably on average across our country about 20% more expensive than they, quote, should be. When I say what should they be, I'm going off of the relationships to income levels that prevailed for the whole second half of the 20th century, and also on guidelines that have long been accepted with federal policymakers. Of course, that 20% varies immensely across geography, but no time to talk about that. I'll talk about your geography here in a moment. I think another fact that sometimes doesn't get enough attention is that as badly as we've done, we would have done really a lot worse, but for growth in a relatively small minority of the places in America. So the 25, if you take the 100 biggest metropolitan areas in the country, the 25 fastest growing ones account for, this is kind of amazing, they account for 42% of all the single family homes that have been built since 2010. They account for 36% of all the apartments that have been built since 2010. These places are essentially all in the Sun Belt and mountain states. They include the metropolitan area where we are, the one that I live in, Dallas-Fort Worth, Austin, Atlanta, where Michael's from, essentially they collectively amount to about 20% of the American people, but have built more or less 40% of the housing. Where have they built it? Overwhelmingly, more than 80% outside core cities in suburban type locations. We are extraordinarily dependent on a relatively small number of really high growth places hanging in there and continuing to grow. That is not healthy. We need housing growth to spread more widely around this country. So some recent events, interest rates. On the demand side of housing, we've caught a little bit of a break a little bit lately, even though, in economics, everything is sort of, on the one hand this, on the other hand that. That's why Harry Truman said, give me a one-handed economist. So you have this mortgage lock-in effect. Essentially, it used to be we had a gigantic number of people, totally unprecedented, moving from California to Texas. Selling a home in LA and moving to Dallas was really, really attractive until you considered that you had a 3% mortgage in LA. You'd have to give it up and enter into a 6.7 or something percent mortgage. In Dallas, all of a sudden it wasn't so great. So that created a little bit of a slowdown in the demand to live in places that had been major magnets. Still, we have a large net movement from California, but it is slower than it was. And that's been a little bit of a, let's say, a break for a little while. We have also learned in the last couple of years something that hopefully would be clear to people. In economics, we really like the idea of supply and demand, okay? Very simply, in housing, to some reasonable degree, new supply works. It actually has the effect that economists say that it does. More supply, given the same demand, means that prices actually go down relative to incomes. Now, we've had such explosive increase in housing prices that a lot of people came to doubt that, came to think the normal rules don't apply. We were talking about this at our table during Duke's really cool learning exercise. We were talking about the fact that if you just quiz ordinary people, and a bunch of academic studies have done this, they will, if you ask them, sort of common sense questions that basically reflect, do they understand the idea of how the laws of supply and demand affect like groceries or affect other ordinary things they buy, they actually understand it really well. But if you ask them about housing, all of a sudden, they totally reject the idea that supply and demand would actually be relevant considerations there. But it turns out we actually had a pretty big building boom, not as good as we might have hoped for, but pretty good in 2020 to 22, and that actually had a notable effect. On average, we actually did drive down home prices relative to people's incomes by a little. In the places that had the biggest booms, like Austin, Texas, of the 100 biggest metros, that's the place that had the single biggest boom, we actually got the biggest effect. So we saw, for example, in the Austin area that relative to rising incomes, we've had some inflation, right? Relative to rising incomes, home prices actually are down almost 20%, and rents are down more than 10%. That's pretty noticeable. That's pretty useful. So a couple other factors that are affecting things, immigration and labor markets. I think that on the immigration side, we have had a gigantic change from faster inflow into our country than has basically ever happened before to actually a rate that just might even be negative right now. So without me opining on immigration policy, let me just state that in the very near term, that if all of a sudden you take out what was a big source of growth in the demand for housing, in the really near term, it probably takes a little bit of heat out of the market. Over a somewhat longer period of time, the supply effects of having not enough labor force will start to accumulate in their effect on home prices. So we've been in kind of maybe a period where, like I said, took a little bit of heat out of demand, but didn't make that much of a difference to supply yet. Tariffs are adding about 3% or so to the cost of building a home now, from what I read. Now, we've heard about this today, and pretty good news, we've actually been living through a period of just the last 2 or 3 years, really, of enormous housing reform ferment around our country. If we were all gathered in 2019, I could not have said that. We would have looked at it and said, you know, Joseph Jorko of the University of Pennsylvania, leading housing economist, carefully documenting this. Essentially, almost everywhere in America, the housing policies were getting worse. If by worse, you mean making it harder to build new housing, harder to keep up with demand. They got worse almost in a straight line, almost everywhere for the first 2 decades of this century. And we've kind of turned the tide. We suddenly have a bunch of reformism. It's you know, takes slightly different flavors in blue places and red places and purple places, but it's happening. And it's happening here in Arkansas in your most recent legislative session, and I'm happy for you for that. So that's kind of interesting, a lot of things happening. So just really quickly, this chart on the left goes back to 1960. How many units are we actually building? 1960, the population was about half what it is today in the United States, and we, you know, on average built around 1.5, 1.6 million homes a year. And you roll forward, and on a per capita basis, we kind of stayed in the same range with fluctuations all through the 20th century. Had a little boomlet in like 2003, 2004, then came the housing crash. And you should see in that blue line that it collapsed to a level that was catastrophic for our country. We then started building our way out, but even in the late teens, we had not gotten back to anything like the normal rate of home building as a percentage of the population. And even if you take into consideration lower population growth, we were still way off where we needed to be. If you look very recent, then we had a little boomlet, like I noted, but even the boomlet at its peak, we were building right around 1.5, 1.6, which I'm going to show you in a second, is still less than we need. This year, on the right, each month, we're running at about 1.3, 1.4. So we are clearly building less and building a deeper hole for ourselves. I've done some math about like the growth in the number of households and so forth, and looking at, well, what is the actual development over time of the need? So the blue and green lines basically show a kind of just a simple calculation of how many should we build each year. The yellow line or orange or whatever that is the actual. You can see it falling off a cliff relative to where it needed to be. And looking ahead, those two lines, they only very gently go up, because we actually are living in a period of much lower population growth now. We still need to be building at a certain rate. I would argue 1.6 to 2.1 million a year. 1.4 is too low. If we go on like this, we clearly dig a deeper and deeper hole. What's happened on the price front? The left-hand chart goes back to 2020. It looks at 3 different measures of affordability. The green, the kind of the straightest one, is rent divided by income. So just how much of people's income goes to rents. And what it shows is kind of a steady, you know, little bit of fluctuation, but mostly trending up ever since 2000, 20% increase relative to the year 2000. The purple is home prices divided by incomes. And there what you see is it kind of goes up over time, but with a couple of big spikes. Home prices, unlike rents, periodically fall prey to speculative manias. I would say we've had 2 of those in the 21st century so far. And the blue line is a kind of a calculation I did of the cost of owning a home that takes into consideration mortgage rates as a function of, as a percentage of income. And there, what you see there, a world of low interest rates tends to produce higher home prices, but not sufficiently higher to make up for the fact that mortgage rates are lower. So we've now returned not to sky-high mortgage levels, but to historically normal levels. And with historically normal levels, on this measure too, we're 20% more expensive than we were at the beginning of the century. On the right, just very simply, what you can see out on the right-hand side of that black line, last 3 years we've been in a period where home prices and rents have actually been declining as a percentage of people's income. So it can be done. It's a little period of a little bit of a breathing space. But I think that if we continue to build at the rate we've been building, the breathing space for sure comes to an end. That's my forecast. So how about Northwest Arkansas? Well, as I suggested, I really want to argue to you, just as with my region, Dallas-Fort Worth, that affordability has been a really important factor over this booming period of the last several decades, and it's clearly diminished significantly. A number on this on the next slide in just a moment. There's obviously been a tremendous growth in the demand to live here. I don't have to tell you all about the immense corporate headquarters, 18,000 people at Walmart headquarters. That's amazing. The 39% growth in the student population at University of Arkansas and 13% 13 years. That's a pretty staggering growth number. That's got to put some stress on Fayetteville, I'm sure. And of course, you all are very rich in all kinds of lifestyle amenities, as we call it, that have been very much in fashion. People have wanted to move towards places of greater lifestyle amenities, usually more in the West, but you've got a great region here for that. Tremendous growth in demand to live here. What I would suggest is that home prices have gone up so much because there was huge growth in demand. There were actually a better environment for building new housing than most places have, but even that wasn't good enough to keep up with explosive increases in demand. So I did in my report, I grade the 250 largest metropolitan areas and individual municipalities on kind of their housing policy environment. And the main thing I'm looking at is I have kind of a predictive model that sort of predicts what would you have expected to see in the way of growth in the housing stock in view of kind of demand conditions, and to what degree is the place constrained by mountains and lakes, such as the Salt Lake area, and how does the place do relative to what you would expect. And on that, of the 100 biggest metropolitan areas, there's only 8 that score higher than Northwest Arkansas. They include Houston and Austin, but not Dallas-Fort Worth. And they include several places in the southeast that have been growing also really, really fast, and Provo, since we've heard about Utah today. I calculate very simply that if you had average policies rather than relatively favorable ones, that home prices and rents would probably be about 20% higher than they are in Northwest Arkansas. So that's the good news. So there's a clear model here, and it's pretty similar around kind of the middle part of America, any place that's growing, which is that we're basically talking about outward expansion, substantially all the growth happening through outward expansion and not through densification of built-up areas. Kind of modest, I'd say much lower than average density in terms of the development pattern here relative to most other Sunbelt places even, not comparing to Brooklyn, comparing to, places in the southeast and in the south. So that's been kind of the model. And then in the outlying areas, extraordinarily low density. I mean, that's really kind of quite striking about the numbers here. So you have to say, well, it's mostly worked okay in the sense that huge population growth has occurred, and the commute times, while they're getting worse, they're still kind of low by the standards of successful places. And then I think a really notable fact is that if you look at the 4 big cities of the region, one thing that's really clear is that all of them sort of want to grow, have plans to grow, are wrestling with the challenges of growth. It wouldn't be hard to travel around America and find places where plainly they do not wish to grow. And even if the mayor sort of says that, watch what he or she does, not what he or she says, because in most cases they don't really want to grow. There is a diversity of environments, so on this scoring system, for what it's worth, I was talking to Representative Clowney about this, that Bentonville and Rogers score off the charts high by American standards, Springdale kind of high, Fayetteville better than the average American city, but still way below the others here. So that's an interesting thing that's beyond my, I don't have the local knowledge to analyze that. Just really quickly on what's happened recently here. The prices, it's really, I was a little bit, eyebrows went up when I looked for this presentation at the most recent price data and saw the average home in Bentonville reaching $483,000. It's a gigantic, almost doubling since 2019. That's clearly more than most high growth places, leaving aside struggling places. And it is also striking that during the period since the beginning of 2023, we've been through almost 3 years in which home prices have gone down relative to incomes in most high growth places, but not here. So that's pretty striking. On the public policy front, we've mostly heard about this, but it's been clear that I think all of the 4 cities here have been, reformers in various ways. So congratulations on the modular the work in Fayetteville, and the state has done the ADU rule. Hopefully, lots more changes to come on the state front. So I kind of took the liberty, did some forecasts here. That's the population of the 2-county region. A pretty stunning growth rate since 1970. Right now, about 615,000, I think, people or so in the 2 counties. And here's the thing. If you go out to 2050, I saw in Duke's game that I think the forecast implicit in that is that you would add about 400,000 people. So I, without knowing about that game, can easily make a case that it actually won't be that it'll be more like 200,000 and you'll go to about 800,000 people. And I can just as easily make a case you'll go to about 1.2 million. with really, I think, sensible assumptions in either case. But those are two really different futures, and the one where you grow less is, I think, one where you entirely lose the cost advantage and actually become more expensive than most places in the middle part of the country. And it's become, living here becomes like Mayor Bloomberg used to say about New York, that it's a luxury good. It's a luxury good that a few people can afford. So it's clear that things have been more successful than in most places here, and that is the case also where I live in Dallas-Fort Worth. I've had the opportunity to talk a lot, in particular, to really fast-growing suburban places that feel like essentially everything's gone right in recent times, but the home prices have been going up a lot. So what I want to suggest to you is that when a community has been experiencing a lot of success in today's America, there are some temptations, and there are some possible traps one could fall into. One basic temptation for any particular town or community would be to try really hard to be as much as possible a low-density bedroom community, even when the residents actually want to have a rich variety of jobs nearby and all kinds of urban amenities nearby. And just to say, like, that's okay, we can do that kind of across the border or across town. Another, and of course everyone understands the problem with that, right? One town might be able to get away with that, sort of, kind of. If everyone thinks the same way, then you don't wind up with enough housing. Another sort of similar temptation would be to say that, well, we all want to have the restaurants, we want to have the coffee shops, we want to have all the various things, good schools, of course, that employ a bunch of people who make lower than average income. They need to live someplace. Maybe they can live in the next town over. That temptation is very, very strong. But again, if every place falls prey to that temptation, you got a huge problem. Another is to build out infrastructure that cannot possibly be financially sustained in the long term based on the tax base that is being built. That's a temptation about trading off the long term for the present, and in the end, it will come back to bite any place that falls for it. This fourth one I put in recently because I've been visiting a lot of really high growth places around Texas, and I'm seeing this model a lot. When you are growing, it can be really tempting to strike what I would say are, in some sense, overly sweet deals with developers, if you will, that basically give so much of the tax base away and get so much less back than you really need in the way of like green space and other basic things, that you lay the foundations for future problems. A number of places in Texas, they frankly need, I'm all for being developer friendly, but they need to kind of slow it all down and rethink what they're trying to be. And then finally, there is a temptation, doesn't seem to be present here yet, but it is certainly present on the West Coast and the Northeast, to reject growth altogether if people think that growth is mostly going to be bad. A couple myths that I want to highlight. One myth would be that, if here in our town or our neighborhood, if we don't allow sufficient housing, that's no big deal because developers can always just go further out, okay? Everyone, that seems kind of an obvious, like that's how we do it in Texas, I can tell you. Why is that a myth? Because if housing goes further and further out, but it's not accompanied by job centers going further and further out, that is necessarily separating the people more and more from the extra people who come in and live in the new housing from where they're actually going to work. And then you start to bump up against a pretty hard ceiling on how much commute most human beings are willing to tolerate. And what that means is that beyond a certain point, the growth will simply hit a wall and stop. And that's why I put a map in the lower left-hand corner of the state of Massachusetts, which has suburbs that are really lovely, other than a bit cold for my taste in the winter, but beautiful places that are extraordinarily difficult to build new housing. Harvard economist Ed Glazer, who lives in one of them, famously says, I'm a total hypocrite because I live in this place that is just the worst in America for building new housing. So what's actually happened in Massachusetts? What's happened, people talk about, the coasts are constrained by oceans. Well, that's true for about the east of Boston, but it's not true to the north, west, or south. What happens, this map shows the density levels at the level of individual counties. Essentially, the Boston area grew to a certain point and totally hit a wall. And it just stopped growing westward altogether. And then back in the core city and in the inner ring suburbs, the home prices went vertical to a degree that is shocking, I think, if you live anywhere in the middle part of the country. Another myth is that even if we kind of mess it up, there'll always be enough people coming to Northwest Arkansas to ensure that every locality will hit its growth goals and the future will be bright. Not so. The lower right-hand corner is Congressional Budget Office forecasts of the population of our country, okay? And the middle one that's red, I think, is kind of their base case. They have a high, low, and then a really low, and the only thing they vary in these assumptions is how much immigration that Congress and the president allow into the country. That's a political decision. We're right now allowing really few. So what does it show? Well, we've lived through a time where we've had shockingly low birth rates by the standards of American history. And by the way, this is a global phenomenon, as you're probably aware. So what do we see? We basically see Congressional Budget Office used to think we'd go from 345 million or so people now to more than 400 million by 2050. Now they believe that that the population will peak out a little after 2050 at about 370 million, slowly crest, and then start downwards and go down forever thereafter. So what that means is the population's not going to, and by the way, that assumes a higher rate of immigration than is currently being allowed into the country. So we're talking about a future where most places aren't going to grow at all. Probably a large minority of places will experience calamitous population decline, and that's the problem that at least our children's generation is going to be talking about. Some warning signs about Northwest Arkansas: commutes are clearly going up, particularly in Benton County. They're not particularly long by the standards of big cities in America, but I don't know, maybe people who come here sort of expect a shorter commute than they would have in Atlanta or Dallas, and if so, that's probably a little bit of a warning sign. This one kind of amazed me too. The price of homes divided by people's income ratios have fully caught up with a bunch of places that are a lot bigger than here. They're about the same level as Dallas-Fort Worth, Atlanta, Raleigh, Greenville, South Carolina is more similar sized, also another booming place, just as expensive, higher than Houston, higher than San Antonio. That was not the case in the early teens. That's pretty striking. So the competition is definitely going to heat up. And then finally, I think that at least outside the four big cities of the region, seems at the extraordinarily low density level that's being built out, that it's really likely that there's not enough tax base being built out to support the future infrastructure needs. So I'm just going to quickly talk through 8 principles, and I'll kind of open things up, and I hope you all have a question or a comment or complaint or two or something. But I like to talk in terms of principles, not specific policies, because I really do think that the overall principles apply everywhere, but the specific policies are place specific. So first 2 principles, that yes, expand outwards, but do it in a smart, sustainable way. And also build more homes within existing built-up areas. It really bugs me that people sometimes put those 2 things into opposition and say that it's got to be one and not the other. It's a sterile and pointless debate. It clearly has to be both. But let me say something about outward expansion. So I've tried really hard to do the math and understand what the quantitative effect is of this reform or that reform in different parts of our country. And what I've concluded is the following: that in the absence of revolutionary policy changes that I think are probably not going to happen, even though I'm an optimistic guy, that the more built-up urban areas of our metropolitan areas, I think if they really hit it well on policy changes, are going to see population growth of like 5 to 7% or something by 2050. They're not going to grow explosively. I just think it's really improbable. The change would have to be so huge to built up, particularly to built up single-family neighborhoods. And probably there isn't even the demand to live in a lot of these places sufficient to actually drive way bigger. So in my simple math, probably about 3/4 of all the growth in the housing stock that we need in America, if it happens, will probably happen in areas that are currently undeveloped or very lightly developed. But the issue is we got to do that smartly. I think a lot of the future of our country will actually be determined by not just what happens close to downtown Bentonville, but what happens on kind of the outskirts of town, what happens in Siloam Springs and other such towns. But the other principle is really important. Oh, and I should just highlight really fast. I'll put in a little advertisement. The lower left-hand corner is an article I commend to you by New York Times journalist Connor Doherty, a fascinating guy, a prominent national writer about housing. He lives in the West Coast. He kind of got this idea that as his article, his title, not mine, Why America Should Sprawl. Sprawl is an ugly word. I don't like to use it, but nonetheless, he interviewed me and we spent a lot of time together in advance of that article, and it's well worth reading because he's not saying we should do exactly what we're doing. He's saying we should expand outward smartly. And he came to North Texas, we spent some time, and he basically says well, this town's doing it pretty well, but this other one's a mess. Don't do that. And I think that's pretty interesting stuff. And then I wrote an article myself in City Journal a few weeks ago that they unfortunately also used the word sprawl, but I was making the case that intelligent suburban expansion can actually be a really good part of the solution. On principle two, though, we've been hearing about this today, but I think that it's just worth highlighting. There's some pretty low-hanging fruit out there. I mean, if a place is building on relatively raw land, outskirts of town, just to allow small homes and townhomes in part of it that just is good practice. It's sort of malpractice not to allow that. Minimum lot size. Representative Clowney and I talked about this some. Houston has been a path leader in that, doing a minimum lot size reform in 1998 and 2013, and it's been exhaustively studied by many think tank people and academic economists. What did we learn? We learned that because of those reforms, allowing developers to take parcels of land and subdivide them into pretty small lots, 1,400 square feet at a minimum, which is a pretty skinny townhome. They have at least 40,000 more housing units in the city of Houston than they otherwise would have just because of that rule change. A lot of their other rules aren't that great. That one rule change was worth a lot. If you translate that to the 4 big cities of Northwest Arkansas, that would be 5,000 units. That would be enough to add about 4% to the population in existing built-up areas just by allowing that reform. And to me, that's a really good one. Allowing residential to be built in commercial. We've had really good reforms in Florida, a brand new one in Texas. Excited about that as well. Let me just quickly say something. We've been mostly talking about, Bentonville and Fayetteville and so on. In this report that I wrote about, I wrote about a phenomenon that I think is interesting and is not the whole solution, but it's part of the solution to what ails us in housing in America. And I came up with this term, liminal cities. Liminal meaning in between big metropolitan areas and rural America. And the idea was that in a world of hybrid work, in a world of fast internet connections, that there would be a new opportunity for places that had been kind of left behind, like places that were over the horizon from the big city, thinking that their future was dark. Almost certainly all the smart kids the ambitious kids would want to leave and go off to the big city. That maybe some of these places, if they actually are nice places to live, will actually have sort of a bright future. And I went to the data on that and actually found why yes. Defining liminal cities a certain way, it turns out after years of population shrinkage, the population growth is actually fantastic since 2010. And I identified places around the country. So I'll just highlight in Northwest Arkansas these 4 towns that collectively have 70,000 people in them, amounting to more than 10% of the people living in the 2 counties, achieving just staggering growth. So if they can just remain charming, nice places to live, but also allow a range of housing types to be built, that's going to be a good part of the solution. Just a couple other slides. Principle 3, we've been hearing all about it. Innovate. Innovate means allow attractive, nice, manufactured housing, like the one, I know we're not supposed to say that term, in the lower left-hand corner. I think that's beautiful. It's not a kind of an unsightly trailer park or anything else, or modular, such as the very attractive home in the middle. We just clearly need to get our regulations smart on that. And we also need to do, number 4, in what I call the Jane Jacobs principle. Everyone aware of Jane Jacobs? The author who wrote arguably the most influential book on American cities in our history, The Death and Life of Great American Cities in 1960, remains as relevant today as it was then. And what she has a lot of things in that book, but I would argue the core principle is the idea that mixing of uses in close proximity is the very lifeblood and the source of vibrancy in cities, that we committed a catastrophic blunder when we tried to separate everything out and have like a sterile zone that is where they have the white-collar office towers and so forth. All of those white-collar office tower zones became dead zones. They've all been kind of, if you will, sort of slowly dying, and in some cases being remade. So we need to allow mixing of use. This lower right-hand corner, pretty vibrant place, is not Brooklyn. It's not a big city. It's a suburb of Indianapolis. It's doable everywhere. Then a couple other things. Allowing dynamic change. Not really a risk in Northwest Arkansas, but we must not fall into the idea that the answer is to lock things in place as they are. We need to, among other things, be a whole lot better at adaptive reuse. Lower left-hand corner from Atlanta, Ponce City Market is one of the great adaptive reuse projects in the world, I would argue. If we try to totally freeze things in place, bad things happen. The middle apartment is a rent-controlled apartment in New York City, trying to keep the same people in the same apartment and try to lock everything, freeze it in amber, as it were, and just doesn't work. Principle 6 is we have to not just get the supply side right, but we have to actually create places where there is a strong demand to live, where people want to be. And you don't have a problem here, but I think it is a problem in a lot of America. So some of that is just getting the basics right. Ed Glazer oftentimes says, that, there's all kinds of wonderful things you could do. Ted Knowlton talked about some of the great things happening in Utah. But before you do any of that, you got to at least have a local government that fixes the streets, maintains reasonable policing and public safety. There's got to be a decent school system or people won't want to be there. The infrastructure's got to work. So no question about that. But also Principle 7, design matters a lot. Create truly great places. Here's two good ones that either already exist or are in process. In North Carolina, the lower left-hand corner is downtown Asheville. It is a great place. People want to be there. The middle one is an artist rendering. You're all aware of Research Triangle Park in North Carolina? Okay, Research Triangle Park was one of the biggest kind of research park innovation hubs in the country, but it was built in a super sprawling, extremely low density way, and it got tired. And there's a really good leader there, Scott Levitan, and he and his team are totally reimagining the place and building a whole new city, as it were, or a new downtown in the heart of it called RTP Hub. And that's a case of trying to do great design and completely remake on pretty grand scale a place that otherwise was probably going to start struggling. And finally, there is a place for subsidized housing. I write about it a lot in my report. It doesn't have to have the stigma that it does. It can be like the upper right-hand corner apartment, a really pretty place, I would say. I do think that in general, we've kind of blown it in the whole subsidized housing space. We've arguably not funded it enough, but we've also managed to figure out how to somehow separate the whole income-restricted housing world from the rest of the housing economy in a way that's added a lot of inefficiency and resulted in some pretty bad results. Now, that said, coming here, one can't come to this region and not come away optimistic because you all have accomplished great things, and I really am pretty confident you will continue to do so. Just recognize that growing wisely and growing well is not just about a good quality of life here. It is making a significant contribution to addressing this problem nationwide, because I do think several 100,000 more people will come to live here rather than someplace else, because you are doing a better job. So please stay at it. And I think if you do, you will have a very bright future. And on that note, I will stop. Thank you.
We do have time for maybe 2 questions. Orlo, you want to start?
Yes. Considering the economics and the future, both on a micro and a macro, even global, where do you see and what do you see happening with energy and the environment?
Energy and the environment, that's a good one. A tough question. Energy, I think that probably a lot of people in the room will be aware that we have been, we've sort of crossed through to the place where, wind, solar are economically competitive under many conditions and have achieved a pretty rapid takeoff in this country and in a number of countries. So I do think we're on kind of a long-term path that probably means something like peak oil use. Maybe it's not the exact true peak, but it's growing really, really slowly now and is very likely looking at shrinkage ahead. So, we're kind of some would argue that we're not on a fast enough path of energy transition, but we're on a decently fast clip of energy transition. So that's good news. The environment, my sense is that I would say it's such a gigantic question. I'm trying to say something useful on any aspect of it. I think that, I guess what I would say is on the environment, I think we need to get a lot more, I'm just going to editorialize, not just sing the same song again and again, but develop a richer repertoire of what we mean when we talk about creating a bright future in terms of how humans interact with the natural world. We talked a lot about climate change. We should talk about climate change. We've got to keep the transition going. We've got to do something smarter. In my own state, Texas is the wind and solar superpower of the country. We've done a pretty great job on that, and we still had a catastrophic power failure in Winter Storm Uri in 2021. We haven't fixed that from a regulatory point of view. So there's still things that need to happen, but we need to actually start thinking about okay, I think it's been pointed out that if Northwest Arkansas just keeps sprawling outwards in a kind of very, very low density way, that a whole lot of really beautiful, some of the most beautiful places in America will get put under concrete, and that will be sad, and people will be upset about that. We need to think a whole lot more about what it actually means to either create or to preserve beautiful spaces with lots of human beings, have good access to them, but they don't despoil the places. What can you say? If you go back and read like Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, early 1960s, we were in a catastrophically bad place. Now we're in a whole lot better place because a lot of human thinking has changed, and I think it's changing as we speak. So I can't help but be sort of optimistic that we're going to pull it together on that. What else would people like to talk about?
Any
Duke, you want?
other questions? Yep.
With global warming, have you done stress scenarios where places that are by the water that are probably going to suffer through global warming will look for places like this? Have you taken that into account?
Yeah, I haven't myself tried to model that. I have colleagues who have. I have a really close friend who's in the econ department at SMU who's done literally 500-year forward. I know that sounds absurd, but nonetheless, just trying to imagine, like under certain trends, what actually happens. I think what he tells me, and my general understanding about how to think about a warming climate is that on the whole, the wetter places will become wetter, the drier places will become drier, the ocean level will rise modestly, but enough to create immense trouble in Bangladesh and a certain amount of trouble in some of our coastal cities like Miami. So when you add all that up, you would expect to see a northward movement of the population in this country, I think. I don't think that the models currently forecast that the sea level rise would be so disastrous as to sort of render Miami unlivable. It would shrink it. The vast majority of the United States is not going to be underwater, but it's going to be hotter. And hotter means, I've asked a person who's very expert in Phoenix, like a Phoenix watcher. And Phoenix, it's like way hotter even than in Dallas, which says a lot. What he basically says is we probably can solve our water problems, believe it or not, but we can't solve the heat problem. So probably, Phoenix is going to bump up against some limits, and probably the population is going to turn around and shrink sometime over the next several decades.
Anything. Let's thank Cullum for his time.